In the quiet, snow-covered town of Maple Grove, Ethan Cooper's life revolved around his small bakery, Hope's Hearth. It was more than a place for pastries. It was a legacy left by his late mother, a symbol of warmth and kindness for the community. But one frigid morning, everything changed. At the doorstep of the bakery, Ethan discovered something he never expected: a worn cardboard box containing 5 frightened children, huddled together for warmth. The oldest boy, Caleb, carried a weight far beyond his years, his eyes filled with fear and defiance. Though their past was shrouded in silence, one thing was clear: they were running from something, or someone. As Ethan takes the children in, he quickly realizes the danger they're in. With the help of his childhood friend Emma, a determined police officer, he uncovers a harrowing truth. A ruthless man named James Bennett, leader of a child trafficking ring, is hunting them. What begins as an act of kindness turns into a fight for survival, as Ethan risks everything to protect the children. But when the line between fear and courage blurs, will his small bakery, once a place of comfort and peace, withstand the storm? The sleepy town of Maple Grove in Vermont rested beneath a thick blanket of snow. The early morning streets were silent, except for the crunch of Ethan Cooper's boots as he stepped outside his bakery, Hope's Hearth. At 36 years old, Ethan had spent the past 5 years running the bakery after inheriting it from his late mother. The bakery wasn't just a business, it was a piece of her, a reminder of warm laughter and flour-covered hands. He tightened his coat and grabbed the shovel from the side of the doorway. Snow had piled up during the night, creating a soft drift against the entrance. As Ethan drove the shovel into the snow, he noticed something unusual: a large cardboard box sitting just in front of the door. His brow furrowed. "That's odd," he muttered, brushing off the top layer of snow. The box was old and worn, with one side ripped. Ethan hesitated before lifting the flaps, and what he saw made him stumble back in shock. Inside were 5 children, bundled together and shivering. The oldest, a boy around 7, stared up at Ethan with wide, fearful eyes. His thin arms were wrapped protectively around the others, a small girl of about 5, twin toddlers who couldn't have been more than 3, and an infant wrapped in a torn blanket. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "Good God, what are you doing out here?" he whispered. The boy didn't answer. His expression was a mixture of defiance and fear. Ethan knelt, his voice soft and steady. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. Let's get you all inside where it's warm." The boy hesitated, but didn't resist when Ethan carefully lifted the infant from the box. One by one, he ushered the children into the bakery. The smell of fresh bread and cinnamon filled the room as the door swung shut behind them. Ethan quickly fetched blankets from the back room and wrapped each child snugly. He filled mugs with warm milk and placed a tray of muffins on the table. "Here," he said gently. "Eat something. It'll help you feel better." The boy eyed the food warily before reaching for a mug. His hands were trembling. The little girl followed his lead, taking a small sip before breaking into quiet sobs. Ethan pulled up a chair across from them. "What's your name?" he asked. The boy paused, then murmured, "Caleb." "Caleb, do you know where your parents are?" Caleb's face hardened. "We don't have any." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to ask more, but didn't want to push. His eyes drifted to their coats, old, too thin for the winter. Then he noticed something else. A small triangular patch sewn onto the sleeves, marked with an unfamiliar symbol. Ethan reached out. "What's this?" Before he could touch it, Caleb yanked his arm back. "Don't!" His voice cracked with fear. The other children flinched. Ethan raised his hands in surrender. "Okay, I won't touch it. I promise." Caleb's breathing slowed, but his eyes stayed fixed on the window. His voice was barely a whisper. "If they see us, they'll take us back." Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. He leaned closer, his voice steady. "No one's going to take you anywhere. You're safe here." Later that morning, as the children warmed up and slowly relaxed, Ethan stepped into the back to make a phone call. He scrolled through his contacts and pressed the familiar name, Emma Hale. Emma was Maple Grove's most dedicated police officer and had been Ethan's best friend since childhood. The phone rang twice before her groggy voice answered. "Ethan, do you know what time it is?" "I know. I'm sorry. But something's happened. I need you to come over. It's serious." Emma's tone sharpened. "What kind of serious?" "There are kids, Emma. 5 of them. Someone left them outside the bakery in a box. And they're terrified." There was a pause before Emma said, "I'm on my way." 15 minutes later, Emma arrived, her hair tucked under a knit beanie and her police coat dusted with snow. She stomped the cold from her boots as she stepped inside. "Ethan, where?" Her eyes landed on the children, who huddled together at the corner table. Caleb's gaze met hers, filled with suspicion. Emma crouched down, her voice calm and kind. "Hey, sweetheart. My name's Emma. I'm here to help." Caleb didn't respond. He wrapped his arms tighter around the little girl. Ethan handed Emma a mug of coffee and motioned her aside. "There's something strange," he said in a low voice. "The patches on their coats, they all have the same symbol." Emma frowned and walked back to take a closer look. She gently pointed to Caleb's sleeve. "Do you know what this means?" Caleb's face went pale. "It's their mark." Emma's brow furrowed. "Whose mark?" "The people who took us," Caleb whispered. "They made us wear these so they'd know who we belong to." Ethan felt his stomach twist. Emma placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder, though he flinched slightly at her touch. "You don't belong to anyone," she said softly. "You're not theirs anymore." Caleb's eyes filled with tears, but he quickly blinked them away. Emma stood and pulled out her phone. "Ethan, we're dealing with something serious. This could be connected to a trafficking ring I've read about." She pressed a number and spoke to dispatch. "I need backup and a patrol unit sent to Hope's Hearth. We have a situation involving multiple minors." Ethan watched as Emma's calm professionalism took over, but his heart ached for the children sitting silently at the table. "What do we do now?" he asked. Emma sighed. "First, we make sure they're safe. But you need to know, Ethan, if this really is what I think it is, those people won't just give up." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Then I won't give up either." Emma gave him a long look, recognizing the resolve in his eyes. "Okay," she said, "but you're not doing this alone." As the first snowflakes of a new storm began to fall outside, Ethan glanced back at the children, who had fallen into an uneasy sleep. His heart tightened with determination. No matter what it took, he was going to protect them. The warm hum of the bakery was interrupted by the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Ethan glanced toward the frosted window, where flashing red and blue lights approached through the snowy street. Emma placed her phone back into her coat pocket and exhaled slowly. "Reinforcements are on their way," she said. Ethan's shoulders sagged with a mix of relief and dread. "What happens now?" Emma's boots crunched softly against the floor as she moved to the children's table. The 5 small figures huddled close together. Caleb's arm still encircled the toddler closest to him, a boy with wide, tired eyes. Emma crouched down and spoke gently. "Hey, Caleb, we're going to make sure you're safe, okay?" Caleb's gaze was wary, flickering between Emma and the door, as though expecting someone to burst through at any moment. His voice was tight with distrust. "They always find us." Ethan felt the weight of the words sink into the room. He pulled out a chair and sat beside Caleb, keeping his voice steady. "Not here. We won't let that happen. Right, Emma?" Emma nodded, her expression softening. "That's right. You're not alone anymore." Caleb didn't answer, but he didn't pull away either. The other children stayed quiet, their tiny faces pale from fear and exhaustion. The girl with golden brown curls, the second oldest, held on to Caleb's sleeve, as if afraid he'd vanish if she let go. "Do you remember your names?" Emma asked the younger ones, trying to help them feel safe. The little girl whispered, "Lily." Her voice was as soft as snowfall. The twins didn't speak, only nestled closer to Caleb. Emma stood and motioned for Ethan to step aside. She lowered her voice. "Ethan, I don't think they trust anyone but him. We need to be careful." Before Ethan could respond, the bakery door opened with a jingle. Two officers walked in, their badges gleaming under the soft glow of the bakery's lights. The taller one, Officer Brady, gave Emma a nod. "Got your call. What's the situation?" Emma gestured toward the table where the children sat. 5 minors, abandoned outside this morning. Possible trafficking victims." Brady's expression darkened. "Do they have any information?" "Not much yet," Emma said. "But they're scared. I need time to figure out what's going on." Brady gave a small nod and leaned toward Ethan. "You're the one who found them?" Ethan crossed his arms, trying to stay calm. "Yes, I brought them inside as soon as I saw them. They were freezing." The second officer, Ruiz, walked toward the back window and peered out. "Emma, you mentioned something about a suspicious symbol?" Emma motioned toward Caleb's coat. "There's a triangle-shaped patch with a strange symbol stitched into it. We're checking if it matches anything in the database." Ruiz frowned. "Could be some kind of branding. I've seen cases like this before." The words sent a shiver through Ethan. Branding. Like they were property. He clenched his fists, struggling to stay composed. "These are kids," he muttered, "not things." Emma placed a hand on Ethan's arm, grounding him. "We'll get them help." The officers ran a preliminary check while Emma continued gathering details. As they worked, the bakery's calm atmosphere became a quiet fortress. Ethan kept busy brewing more hot chocolate and cleaning the tables, but his mind couldn't rest. He felt a small tug at his sleeve and turned to see Lily looking up at him. "Mister, is it okay if I sit closer to the fire?" Ethan's heart softened. "Of course, sweetheart." He carried one of the chairs near the small stove in the corner and wrapped another blanket around her shoulders. She gave a shy smile, and for the first time, Ethan saw a hint of warmth return to her eyes. The bell above the door jingled again. This time, a familiar face appeared: Thomas Blake, a retired firefighter and one of Ethan's oldest family friends. "Thomas?" Ethan blinked in surprise. Thomas stomped the snow off his boots and shook out his coat. "Emma called me. She said you might need some extra hands." Ethan's throat tightened. "I don't know what to say." Thomas waved a hand. "You don't have to say anything. I'm here to help." He glanced at the children and gave a small, reassuring smile. "Hey there, kiddos. You're safe now." The children stared, unsure of what to make of this broad-shouldered man with a weathered but kind face. Thomas set his coat down and leaned toward Ethan. "I'll stay the night if you need me." Ethan swallowed hard, grateful, beyond words. "Thank you." The day passed slowly, and by evening, the bakery had settled into a quiet stillness. Officer Brady and Ruiz had left after assuring Emma that they'd keep patrol cars nearby. As the sun set, the street outside the bakery was coated in shades of pink and orange, though the cold remained sharp. Ethan closed the front curtains and locked the door. Emma stayed behind to debrief with Thomas. "We've confirmed that the symbol matches report from other states. This is connected to a trafficking ring operating in multiple towns." Thomas's jaw tightened. "So, what's the next move?" Emma exhaled. "We need evidence to take down the people responsible, but in the meantime, we need to keep these kids hidden." Ethan's head snapped up. "You think someone's coming for them?" Emma's eyes darkened. "If this is who I think it is, yes." The room fell silent. Thomas's gaze shifted toward the children, who were sitting near the fireplace. Caleb was whispering softly to Lily, the twins curled up beside them. Ethan felt a wave of fierce protectiveness rise in him. "They're not taking them," he said firmly. Emma met his gaze. "We'll do everything we can. But Ethan, you need to be prepared. They won't give up easily." Ethan nodded, the determination in his heart hardening. "Neither will I." As night fell, Ethan turned off the bakery's main lights, leaving only a dim glow from the fireplace. Upstairs, he had cleared out the small storage room and laid out blankets and cushions to make a cozy sleeping area. The children climbed the stairs slowly, their tired feet dragging. Caleb helped Lily settle down with the twins. Ethan watched from the doorway as Caleb tucked the infant in with surprising gentleness. When Ethan placed a pillow next to the mattress for Caleb, the boy looked up, his eyes weary but grateful. "Why are you helping us?" Caleb asked softly. Ethan knelt down so they were eye level. "Because you deserve to be safe. You deserve kindness." Caleb's eyes shimmered in the firelight. "No one's ever said that to us before." Ethan's throat tightened, but he managed a small smile. "Then it's time someone did." Caleb nodded, his shoulders relaxing just a little. For the first time, Ethan saw the boy's guard lower. As the children drifted into sleep, Ethan stood quietly at the top of the stairs, watching over them. He knew the days ahead would be difficult, but as he listened to their soft breathing and watched the firelight flicker, one thought burned in his heart. He would protect them, no matter what. The morning sun rose slowly, casting a pale glow over Maple Grove as the town stirred to life. Inside the bakery, the air was thick with the scent of cinnamon rolls and fresh coffee. Ethan stood behind the counter, absently kneading dough, his mind clouded with worry. He glanced toward the stairs where the children were still asleep. It had been a long, uneasy night. He and Thomas had taken turns watching the windows, listening for any unusual sounds outside. The doorbell chimed as Emma walked in, bundled in her police jacket. "Morning," she greeted, though her voice lacked its usual warmth. "Morning," Ethan replied. He set down the dough and wiped his hands. "Anything new?" Emma sighed, brushing snow off her coat. "Not yet, but I wanted to check in. How are the kids holding up?" "They're sleeping for now," Ethan said, glancing upstairs. "Caleb's still on edge, though. He barely closes his eyes." Emma nodded, her face tightening. "That boy's been through more than any kid should. He's holding the weight of the world on his shoulders." Ethan poured a fresh cup of coffee for her. "And what about you? You look exhausted." Emma smiled faintly and took the cup. "Long night. I was going over reports trying to piece everything together. We're tracking James Bennett's movements, but he's slippery." Ethan's grip on the counter tightened at the mention of the name. "So he's the one behind this?" Emma nodded grimly. "We're almost certain. James Bennett is the leader of a trafficking ring that's been operating across state lines for years. He's careful, never stays in one place long, and uses middlemen to do his dirty work." She lowered her voice. "But he made a mistake. The children's escape gave us a lead." Ethan's heart thudded painfully. "Do you think he's looking for them?" Emma set her mug down. "Yes, and if he knows they're here, he won't stop until he gets what he wants." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. The bakery, once a place of comfort, now felt like a battleground. "Then what do we do?" Emma's gaze was steady. "We make sure he doesn't get close. My team is increasing patrols, and I've asked for surveillance. But I need you to stay alert. Lock the doors. Keep the kids out of sight." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'll do whatever it takes." Just as Emma was about to leave, Thomas walked in from outside, shaking snow from his coat. His face was set with quiet concern. "There's something you both need to see," he said. Emma and Ethan exchanged a look before following him to the front window. Thomas pointed down the street. Parked near the corner was a sleek black car. Two men sat inside, their faces partially obscured by the frosted windows. "They've been there for over an hour," Thomas said. "They haven't gotten out, but they're watching the bakery." Ethan's stomach twisted. Do you think it's them? Emma's jaw clenched. It's possible. She reached for her radio. I'll call it in. Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't ignore the cold, sinking feeling in his gut. He remembered Caleb's quiet warning. They always find us. Minutes later, Emma's radio crackled as a response came through. Dispatch, we've logged the report. Patrol unit is en route. Emma clipped the radio to her belt and turned to Ethan. We need to act like everything's normal. Don't let them see we're on edge. Ethan nodded, though his heart was pounding. He glanced toward the kitchen, where the children would soon wake up, oblivious to the danger parked just outside. The bakery door chimed again, and an older woman stepped inside. It was Mrs. Rosen, one of Ethan's regulars. Her presence was like a breath of fresh air, bright and familiar. She clapped her gloved hands together and smiled. Good morning, Ethan. I hope you've got my favorite today. Ethan forced a smile. Morning, Mrs. Rosen. We've got apple muffins fresh from the oven. Her eyes lit up. Perfect. My grandkids will be thrilled. As Ethan filled her order, Mrs. Rosen's eyes wandered to the corner of the room, where a small pair of children's shoes sat neatly near the fireplace. Oh, whose little ones are those? She asked, her voice soft with curiosity. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before replying, They're staying with me for a few days. Friends of the family. Mrs. Rosen's smile was kind. That's lovely of you. If you need any help, let me know. My boys are grown, but I remember how much work little ones can be. Ethan's throat tightened at her unexpected kindness. Thank you, Mrs. Rosen. I'll keep that in mind. She waved cheerfully as she left, but the moment the door closed behind her, Ethan's smile faded. See what I mean? Emma said quietly. People are noticing. We have to be careful. The wrong person could catch on. By late afternoon, the black car was still there, unmoving. The sight of it gnawed at Ethan's nerves. He found himself peeking through the curtains every few minutes, looking for any sign of movement. The children stayed upstairs, playing quietly. Caleb was teaching Lily how to fold paper cranes from an old book Ethan had found. The sight of their small, determined faces brought a bittersweet ache to his chest. Just as the sun began to set, Ethan's phone buzzed with a message from Emma. Emma, we confirmed the car is registered under one of Bennett's aliases. Stay vigilant. Backup is nearby. Ethan read the message twice, dread curling in his gut. He looked out the window again, but this time the black car was gone. Thomas stepped up behind him. They've left. Ethan exhaled, but it wasn't relief, only the unsettling quiet of knowing the danger was still lurking. They'll be back, he muttered. Thomas nodded grimly. Probably, but we'll be ready. As evening settled in, the bakery grew quiet. Ethan locked every door and window, checked the cameras Emma had installed, and made sure the children were settled in the small room upstairs. Caleb watched Ethan from the corner of the room, his brow furrowed with worry. Mr. Ethan, do you really think they're gone? Ethan knelt beside the boy and placed a hand on his shoulder. For now, maybe. But even if they come back, we won't let them hurt you. Caleb's lip trembled, but he nodded. I believe you. Ethan's heart ached as he ruffled the boy's hair. Try to get some sleep, okay? That night, as the snow fell softly outside, Ethan lay awake on the couch downstairs. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like the snowfall outside. But he wasn't afraid of the fight ahead, not when he had something worth protecting. In the quiet glow of the firelight, he made a promise to himself. No matter who came to the door, no matter what threats they brought, he would stand his ground. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that burned brighter than fear. The morning frost clung to the windows of Hope's hearth as the bakery stirred to life once again. Ethan rose early, despite the weight of his restless night. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the front window, watching the street bathed in soft winter light. For the moment, everything was quiet. Too quiet. The black car from yesterday was gone, but the unease in Ethan's chest remained. He glanced at the staircase, where the children were still sleeping soundly in the room upstairs. Caleb had finally drifted off around midnight, though his small body remained curled protectively around Lily and the twins. As Ethan turned back toward the counter, the front bell chimed. His heart jumped slightly at the sudden sound. When he looked up, a tall man in a tailored black coat had stepped inside. The man's polished shoes tapped softly against the floor as he walked toward the counter. His hair was slicked back, and his pale face held a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked calm, collected, and out of place in their quiet town. Ethan felt a chill roll down his spine. "Good morning," the man greeted, his voice smooth but sharp, like a knife hidden in silk. "Hope's Hearth, right? I've heard this bakery is famous around here." Ethan forced a polite nod, though his instincts screamed at him to stay wary. "That's right. How can I help you?" The man's gaze wandered slowly across the room, taking in the cozy decorations and the warmth of the fireplace. Then his eyes drifted toward the corner, where a stack of children's shoes sat near the coat rack. Ethan's heart quickened. He moved slightly to block the man's view. The man's smile widened as though he'd noticed the gesture. "I'm just passing through town on business. Thought I'd try one of your famous pastries. What would you recommend?" Ethan swallowed the tension building in his throat. "Apple pie," he said, his voice steady. "It's our most popular." The man nodded slowly. "Apple pie, then." Ethan turned and moved to the kitchen, but his thoughts raced. He didn't trust this man, not for a second. There was something calculated about the way he moved, the way he watched everything. Ethan slid a slice of pie onto a plate and returned to the counter. The man's eyes were still fixed on the room, though he now spoke in a softer tone. "You seem like a thoughtful man, Mr. Cooper. A man who knows when to stay in his lane." Ethan's hands stilled as he set down the plate. He forced himself to meet the man's gaze. "Do I know you?" The man's smile didn't waver. "Not yet." He slid a few crisp bills onto the counter. "But I think you understand there are things you shouldn't interfere with." Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears, but he kept his face calm. "I'm not sure what you mean." The man's eyes glimmered with something cold. "Good. Let's keep it that way." He took a slow bite of the pie and hummed in approval. "Delicious." As he turned to leave, the man paused near the door and glanced back. "Have a nice day, Mr. Cooper." The bell chimed softly as he stepped outside, his breath forming faint clouds in the cold air. Ethan stood frozen behind the counter, watching the man stroll down the street until he disappeared behind a row of shops. Emma arrived 5 minutes later, her sharp eyes immediately locking onto Ethan's tense expression. "What happened?" Ethan released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Someone came in, a man in a black coat. He said he was here for pie, but he wasn't." Emma's brow furrowed as Ethan recounted the conversation. "What did he look like?" "Tall, pale, clean-cut," Ethan said. His voice, it was like he knew something, like he was warning me to stay out of this. Emma's jaw tightened. "That sounds like James Bennett." Ethan's stomach dropped. "The leader?" Emma nodded. "It matches his description. And if he's here personally, it means he's not leaving without those kids." Ethan's fists clenched. "Then we need to be ready." The day passed in a haze of unease. Ethan stayed close to the bakery's front window, scanning the street for any sign of James or the black car. Thomas returned in the afternoon, carrying an old metal rod in case things went south. "We can't let them catch us off guard," Thomas said, his voice grim. "If they're bold enough to show up here in broad daylight, they'll make a move soon." Ethan nodded, his jaw set with resolve. "I'm not letting him near them." That evening, Ethan decided to move the children upstairs to the room he'd converted into a temporary sleeping area. He brought out extra blankets, laid out cushions, and made it feel as cozy as possible. The fireplace crackled softly downstairs, sending warmth up through the floors. As the children settled in, Caleb sat by the window, staring out into the snowy street. His face was pale, his shoulders tense. Ethan approached quietly and draped a blanket around the boy's shoulders. "You okay?" Ethan asked gently. Caleb shook his head. "He's here, isn't he?" Ethan knelt beside him. "Who?" Caleb's voice was barely a whisper. "The man in the black coat. He's the one who used to come to the place where they kept us." A wave of anger surged through Ethan, but he forced himself to stay calm. "He won't take you back, Caleb. I promise." Caleb turned, his eyes red-rimmed but steady. "You don't know what he's like. He always finds us." Ethan placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice firm. "Not this time. We're not running. We're standing together." For the first time, Caleb didn't argue. He only nodded, though his small hands still trembled slightly. Later that night, as the wind howled outside, Ethan sat downstairs by the door. Thomas was next to him, the metal rod resting across his lap. The bakery's lights were off, and the curtains were drawn tight. The hours stretched on in silence until, around midnight, the soft crunch of footsteps echoed outside. Thomas's eyes snapped open. "Someone's out there!" Ethan rose, his heart pounding. He peered through a small gap in the curtains and froze. James was back, standing just a few feet from the door, his face illuminated by the pale glow of the street lamp. He wasn't alone this time. Two men dressed in black coats flanked him. Ethan turned to Thomas, his voice low and steady. "They're making their move." Thomas gripped the rod tightly and gave a small nod. "Then we'd better be ready." Ethan took a deep breath and steeled himself. He wasn't just protecting a bakery, he was protecting a family, and he wasn't about to let it be taken from him. The cold pressed against the windows of Hope's hearth as the soft crunch of snow grew louder. Ethan's breath was shallow as he watched James Bennett and his two men approach the bakery door. Each step they took felt like a countdown. Thomas gripped the metal rod in his hand and whispered, "Stay calm. If they force their way in, we'll hold them off until Emma gets here." Ethan nodded, but couldn't shake the burning fear in his chest. His mind raced with everything that was at stake: the children upstairs, the promises he had made to Caleb, and the danger now standing at his doorstep. James stopped just outside the door, his breath clouding in the frigid air. He raised a hand and knocked. The sound echoed through the quiet bakery like a warning bell. Ethan stepped forward, tightening his grip on the door handle. "What do you want?" he called through the door, trying to keep his voice steady. James's smooth, measured voice drifted through the wood. "Mr. Cooper, let's not make this difficult. I believe you know why I'm here." Ethan's fingers curled into fists. "You're not getting them." There was a pause, and then James chuckled, a low, cold sound. "Do you think you can protect them? You're one man against us." Ethan's heart pounded, but he didn't move. "You're right. I'm just one man," he said, his voice hardening. "But you're not getting through me." The air outside felt heavier, as though the night itself held its breath. James leaned closer to the door. "I've been patient, but my patience is running out. Open the door, or I'll break it down." Thomas stepped beside Ethan, his eyes narrowed. "Let him try." There was another pause, and then James muttered something to his men. Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline as the door suddenly shook under a heavy kick. He stumbled back but caught himself. The men outside slammed their shoulders against the wood, making the hinges groan. Thomas raised the metal rod, his eyes sharp. "Stay behind me." The door shuddered again, but this time Ethan didn't wait for it to give. He grabbed the rod from Thomas and yanked the door open just enough to surprise the men. In one swift motion, he swung the rod toward the nearest attacker. The man barely had time to react before the blow struck his shoulder, sending him staggering back. Thomas charged forward and slammed the second man into the doorframe with a powerful shove. The man grunted in pain, but stayed on his feet, drawing a knife from his coat. "Knife!" Thomas shouted, raising his arms defensively. The blade gleamed under the street lamp, but before the man could strike, Ethan stepped in, using the rod to knock the weapon from his hand. The knife clattered to the ground, disappearing into the snow. James watched from a few feet away, his smirk fading into a cold glare. "Enough!" he barked. The two men froze, breathing hard. Ethan's chest heaved as he tightened his grip on the rod. James straightened his coat, his calm composure returning. "You're making this far messier than it needs to be, Mr. Cooper." Ethan took a step forward, his pulse still racing. "I told you you're not getting them." James tilted his head slightly. "You think you've won something tonight? You haven't. This is just the beginning." His gaze flicked toward the distant sound of approaching sirens. Thomas noticed it too. "Emma," he whispered. James's smirk returned, though his eyes remained cold. "Next time, you won't see me coming." With a small signal from James, the two men hurried back toward their black car. The vehicle's headlights flared to life as the engine roared. Within seconds, they were speeding down the snow-covered street. Ethan didn't move until the car disappeared around the corner. The tension in his shoulders finally eased as the bakery door swung open wider. Emma's patrol car screeched to a halt in front of the bakery, her face tense as she stepped out. "Ethan!" Emma ran up the steps, her eyes scanning the scene. "Are you okay?" Ethan nodded, though his hands still trembled. "They were here. James, he tried to break in." Emma's expression darkened. "Did they hurt you?" "No." Ethan shook his head. "But he's not done. He said this is just the beginning." Thomas leaned against the doorframe, catching his breath. "That man's dangerous, Emma. He had backup, and he wasn't afraid to use them." Emma's jaw tightened as she took out her radio. "Dispatch, we need a full patrol sweep of Maple Grove. Suspects fled in a black sedan heading westbound. Keep all units alert." The radio crackled as the dispatcher confirmed the call. Emma turned back to Ethan and Thomas. "I'm doubling the patrol around the bakery, but you need to understand James doesn't bluff. He'll be back." Ethan wiped his face with a shaking hand. "I can't let him take those kids, Emma. I won't." Emma placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice steady but firm. "You did the right thing tonight, Ethan. But you can't do this alone. We have a plan in motion." Upstairs, Caleb sat by the window, peeking out between the curtains. He had heard the commotion and seen the car drive away. His small hands were still clenched into fists. When Ethan finally walked upstairs, Caleb's eyes met his. "Is he gone?" Ethan crouched down beside him and nodded. "For now?" Caleb's voice was small but steady. "He always comes back." Ethan reached out and rested a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Not this time. We'll stop him." Caleb stared at Ethan for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of doubt. When he didn't find any, the boy finally nodded. Later that night, after the patrol cars drove by one last time and the bakery settled into an uneasy quiet, Ethan and Thomas sat near the fire. "You did good, Ethan," Thomas said, his voice low. Ethan let out a slow breath. "I don't feel like it. That man could have hurt us. Or worse." Thomas shook his head. "But he didn't. You protected those kids." Ethan stared into the fire's glow, its warmth chasing away the cold fear that still lingered in his chest. "I'm not afraid of him," Ethan said softly. "I'm afraid of failing them." Thomas gave a small, understanding nod. "Then don't." As the fire crackled and the storm outside began to calm, Ethan closed his eyes and whispered a silent promise. No matter what came next, he wouldn't let fear win. Hope's Hearth wasn't just a bakery, it was a refuge. And for the 5 children asleep upstairs, it was their last chance at safety. Ethan knew he would give everything he had to keep that promise. The morning came with pale sunlight filtering through the frosted windows of Hope's Hearth. Snow blanketed the street outside, and everything seemed peaceful. But inside, the tension was as thick as the smell of fresh bread. Ethan stood by the counter, staring into his cup of coffee, though he hadn't taken a sip. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind: the pounding at the door, the cold smirk on James's face, and the threat that still lingered like a dark shadow. Footsteps thudded softly down the stairs. Caleb appeared, wrapped in a blanket. He moved slowly, his small face pale with exhaustion, but his eyes were alert. "Good morning," Ethan said gently, setting down his mug. Caleb didn't reply right away. He shuffled to the window and peered out, as if expecting to see the black car parked there again. "Is it really safe?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Ethan knelt beside him and spoke with quiet determination. "Yes. Emma's got officers patrolling the street. No one's getting near you." Caleb nodded slowly, though doubt still clouded his face. "You don't understand. James isn't like other people. He doesn't stop until he gets what he wants." Ethan's heart ached at the fear behind the boy's words. "Caleb, I know he's scary, but you're not alone in this anymore." Caleb hesitated, then whispered, "There's something I need to tell you." Ethan sat down, leaning in so Caleb wouldn't have to raise his voice. "What is it?" Caleb fidgeted with the edge of his blanket. "When they took us, they kept us in a big cold place by the water. I don't know exactly where, but I remember the sound of the river and the smell of wood, like crates." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Do you think it was a warehouse?" Caleb nodded. "Yeah, it had these big metal doors and pipes that made loud noises at night." He swallowed hard. "That's where they kept the others." Ethan's chest tightened. "The others? There are more kids?" Caleb's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I think so. When we escaped, not everyone made it out." Ethan felt a surge of anger, not at Caleb, but at the cruelty these children had endured. He reached out and squeezed Caleb's shoulder gently. "Thank you for telling me. This is important." Caleb's voice wavered. "Can you tell Emma? Maybe she can find them." Ethan nodded. "I will." Within minutes, Emma arrived at the bakery, her face lined with fatigue but alert. "You said Caleb remembered something?" Ethan explained everything Caleb had told him. Emma listened intently, her eyes narrowing as she absorbed each detail. "A warehouse by the river," she repeated, tapping her fingers against the counter. "That narrows things down. There's an old industrial district near the South Bend, where most of the old warehouses are abandoned." "Do you think that's where they are?" Ethan asked. Emma nodded. "It's our best lead. I'll need to pull records, but if Caleb's memory is right, this could be where James's operation is based." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Then we have to move fast." Emma held up a hand. "Hold on. We can't just rush in. If we blow this, we might never get another chance. I need to coordinate with the team and make sure we have enough evidence to shut them down completely." Ethan exhaled slowly, knowing she was right. "How long will it take?" "Not long," Emma promised. "But you need to keep things as normal as possible here. The last thing we want is to tip James off that we're closing in." That afternoon, the bakery filled with the soft chatter of regular customers. Mrs. Rosen came in with her usual cheerful energy, asking for her favorite pastries. Ethan did his best to keep up appearances, though his mind was elsewhere. Meanwhile, upstairs, Caleb stayed close to the window, his gaze fixed on the quiet street below. Lily sat beside him, coloring with crayons, though her eyes kept flicking toward her brother. "Is Mr. Ethan going to stop the bad men?" she asked softly. Caleb nodded, though his expression was serious. "He's trying." By evening, the bakery had grown quiet again. Emma returned, this time carrying a thick folder of documents. Thomas had also arrived, ready to stand guard for another night. Emma spread the folder out on the table and showed Ethan a map of the industrial district. "We've got 3 warehouses near the river that match Caleb's description. We're planning a raid, but we need to confirm which one is the right location." Ethan stared at the map, his mind racing. "And what about here?" What if James makes another move? Emma's face hardened. We've stationed plainclothes officers nearby. If James shows up again, we'll be ready. But you need to promise me something. Ethan met her gaze. What? Emma's voice was low but firm. If anything happens, if things get dangerous, you call us immediately. Do not try to handle this alone. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Okay? Later that night, the bakery fell into a heavy silence as snow drifted softly outside. The children had settled upstairs, though Caleb was still restless. Ethan found him sitting at the top of the stairs, staring at the shadows below. Ethan sat beside him. Can't sleep? Caleb shook his head. What if something goes wrong? Ethan leaned back, resting his elbows on his knees. Sometimes, I think about that too. But you know what my mom used to tell me when I was scared? Caleb glanced up at him. What? She'd say, courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about standing your ground, even when you are. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then whispered, Do you think we'll ever have a normal life? Ethan's heart ached, but he managed a small smile. Yes, and I'll do everything I can to make sure you do. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the night deepened, Ethan felt the weight of the upcoming battle settle over him. But something else burned brighter within him, a fierce determination to see this through. Because no matter what happened next, he knew one thing for certain. Hope's Hearth had become more than a bakery. It was a sanctuary, and he would protect it and the children within it at all costs. The sun barely crested the horizon when Emma called Ethan. Her voice, though steady, carried an edge of urgency. We've identified the location. Caleb's memory was spot on. There's an old warehouse by the South Bend one with river access and reinforced steel doors. It matches his description exactly. Ethan sat up on the couch where he had dozed off. The fire had burned low, and the bakery was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock. So, what happens now? He asked, his voice hoarse from sleep. Emma's answer came without hesitation. We move tonight. My team is finalizing the raid plan. Once we move in, we'll rescue the other children and arrest every one of Bennett's men. Ethan felt a surge of relief, but also a stab of fear. What about here? If James realizes you're moving on the warehouse, he could come for the kids. We've thought of that, Emma said. We'll keep officers stationed around the bakery. But Ethan… She paused, and her tone softened. We need to move the children to a safer place before the raid starts. Ethan rubbed his temples, the weight of her words pressing down. You mean, take them away from here? Just temporarily, Emma assured him. There's a secure house on the outskirts of town. They'll have everything they need, and you can go with them, but we can't risk keeping them in the open anymore. Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing toward the upstairs room where the children were still asleep. I promised them they'd be safe. If I leave with them, they'll know something's wrong. Emma's voice softened even more. You're not breaking your promise, Ethan. You're keeping it. By mid-morning, the bakery hummed with quiet preparations. Thomas arrived with his usual calm determination, though Ethan could see the worry etched into his friend's face. They'll be better off somewhere more secure, Thomas said, as he helped Ethan pack a bag of essentials for the kids. This place isn't a fortress, Ethan. You've done everything you can. Ethan nodded reluctantly. He knew Thomas was right, but that didn't make it any easier. How do you tell 5 kids that they have to leave the only safe place they've known? Thomas gave a faint smile. You don't. You show them it's just another step towards something better. That afternoon, Emma pulled up in an unmarked police SUV. She stepped out, wearing plain clothes to avoid attention. We're ready when you are, she said, glancing up at the bakery windows. Ethan took a deep breath and called upstairs. Caleb, Lily, everyone come down here for a minute. The soft sound of small footsteps followed as the children filed down the stairs. Caleb was the last to appear, his sharp eyes immediately noticing the duffel bag by the door. What's going on? Ethan knelt so he was eye level with them. We're going on a little trip, he said, keeping his tone calm. It's a safe place outside of town. Emma's friends will be there to help us. Lily clutched Caleb's sleeve. Why do we have to go? Caleb's expression darkened. It's him, isn't it? James is coming back. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Emma's team is doing everything they can to stop him. But until they do, I need you to trust me and stay somewhere safer. Caleb's small hands balled into fists. I don't want to run again. You're not running, Ethan said firmly. You're staying safe so you can come back home. Caleb's lower lip trembled, but he stayed silent. Finally, he gave a small nod. The drive to the safe house was quiet, the snow-covered trees passing by in a blur. The house itself was small but welcoming, with warm yellow curtains and a fenced yard. Emma's team had already arrived, securing the perimeter and preparing supplies. Inside, the living room had been transformed into a cozy space with blankets, pillows, and a small box of toys. The younger children immediately gravitated toward the soft cushions, but Caleb stayed near the door, watching as the officers checked the locks and windows. Ethan walked over and knelt beside him. What do you think? Caleb's voice was small but steady. It's nice, but it doesn't feel like home. Ethan ruffled his hair gently. It's just for a little while, and I'm staying here with you. Caleb relaxed slightly, though the tension in his shoulders remained. Promise? Ethan nodded. Promise. As the sun set and snowflakes began to fall again, Emma gathered her team in the kitchen to finalize the raid plans. Thomas stood by the window, his sharp eyes scanning the snowy road for any sign of trouble. Emma unfolded the map of the industrial district and traced a line toward the marked warehouse. We'll approach from two sides, one team at the front entrance and one covering the back. James's men won't see us coming. Thomas crossed his arms. And if James isn't there? Emma's jaw tightened. Then we track him down until he has nowhere left to hide. Ethan listened silently, his mind turning over everything that could go wrong. He knew Emma's team was capable, but James was unpredictable, a man willing to cross any line to get what he wanted. As Emma's team moved into position to head out, she caught Ethan's gaze. We'll bring them home, she said quietly. Ethan's throat tightened. Be careful, Emma. She nodded, then turned to her team. It's time. The house grew still after Emma's team left, the only sounds coming from the crackling fireplace and the quiet breaths of the children as they slept. Ethan sat in the living room staring at the fire, his heart heavy with worry. Thomas walked over and handed him a cup of coffee. You did everything you could, Thomas said quietly. Ethan nodded, though his thoughts were miles away at the riverfront, in the cold, dark warehouse where innocent lives hung in the balance. I just want it to be over, Ethan muttered. For them. It will be, Thomas replied, his voice steady, because people like you and Emma don't give up. Ethan let those words settle into his heart. No, he wouldn't give up, not now, not ever. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the promise of another storm. But this time, Ethan didn't feel fear. He felt resolve. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, and they would win. The night was bitterly cold as Emma and her team moved through the shadows near the riverfront. The old industrial district loomed ahead, its empty warehouses dark against the snow-covered ground. The air was thick with the scent of cold steel and water from the river. Emma raised her hand, signaling for silence as the team approached their target. The warehouse Caleb had described stood at the edge of the lot, its rusted metal doors slightly ajar. A faint yellow glow seeped from inside, but the surrounding area was deathly still. Emma's breath formed a small cloud as she whispered into her radio. Team 1, in position. Team 2, take the rear entrance. The quiet crackle of confirmation came through her earpiece. Her heart thudded as she moved forward, her gun drawn. They had planned every detail, but raids like this were unpredictable and dangerous. Inside the warehouse, James Bennett paced beside a row of crates. His calm exterior had cracked, revealing the storm beneath. He had underestimated Ethan Cooper, and that mistake had cost him precious time. One of his men approached nervously. "We've packed most of the cargo, but the police, they're getting too close." James's jaw tightened as he turned toward the dim corner where half a dozen frightened children huddled beneath thin blankets. Their small faces were pale with fear. "We're not leaving empty-handed," James growled. "Finish loading. We leave in 10 minutes. Suddenly a faint creak echoed from the front of the warehouse. James's sharp eyes flicked toward the sound. "Did you hear that?" The man's face paled. "Probably the wind." James wasn't convinced. His instincts prickled with danger. "Get ready." At the front entrance, Emma counted down silently. 3, 2, 1. With a single motion, her team surged forward, bursting through the doors. Flashlights cut through the dark, illuminating the cold expanse of the warehouse. "Police, drop your weapons," Emma's voice rang out. The scene erupted into chaos. James's men scrambled for cover, some reaching for their weapons, others making a run for the back exit. Emma's team moved like clockwork, sweeping the room with precision. James stood still amidst the commotion, his cold eyes meeting Emma's across the room. "You're too late," he sneered. Emma leveled her gun at him. "It's over, James." James's smirk deepened as he stepped back toward the children. "Not yet." One of the officers shouted, "We found the kids. Over here." Emma's heart squeezed as she saw them 6 small, terrified faces peeking out from behind the crates. She kept her focus on James, but signaled to her team, "Get them out of here. Now!" 2 officers moved in quickly, wrapping the children in warm blankets and leading them toward the exit. James's expression twisted with fury as he watched his leverage slip away. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "It changes everything," Emma said, stepping closer. For a moment, it looked like James was about to surrender. Then his hand shot toward the inside of his coat. "Gun!" someone yelled. Emma reacted instinctively, ducking as James fired a shot that ricocheted off the metal beams. She returned fire, the deafening crack of her weapon echoing through the warehouse. James staggered, gripping his shoulder where the bullet had grazed him. "Move in," Emma commanded. Her team closed in, tackling James to the ground. His face twisted in pain and rage as the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. "You'll never stop all of us," James hissed through gritted teeth. Emma leaned in, her voice cold and steady. "Maybe not, but we stopped you." The scene outside the warehouse was a blur of flashing lights and distant sirens. Paramedics tended to the children, wrapping them in thermal blankets and offering warm drinks. Emma stood by the side of a patrol car, watching as James and his remaining men were loaded into police vehicles. The weight of the mission lifted slightly, replaced by a fierce sense of relief. Her radio crackled to life. "Emma, the kids are safe, all accounted for." Emma closed her eyes for a brief second, letting out a slow breath. "Copy that." Back at the safe house, Ethan paced near the window, watching the falling snow. He had tried to distract himself by reading to the kids and helping them settle, but every second dragged by like an hour. Caleb sat curled on the couch, his eyes fixed on Ethan. "You're worried about her, aren't you?" Ethan nodded, his voice soft. "Yeah." "She'll be okay," Caleb said, though his small voice trembled. "She's brave." Ethan forced a smile and walked over, sitting beside Caleb. "So are you." Caleb leaned into Ethan's side, and for a moment, the room was quiet, except for the crackling fire. Then Ethan's phone buzzed. He grabbed it quickly and answered. "Emma?" Her voice came through, steady but tired. "It's over. We got them all, and we found the children." Ethan felt a wave of relief so strong that he had to sit down. Thank God. Caleb sat up straighter, his eyes wide. The others, are they okay? Ethan nodded, his throat tight. She said they're safe. Caleb's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, the weight of everything seemed to lift from his small frame. We didn't lose them, he whispered. Ethan pulled him into a hug, holding him tight. No, we didn't. A few hours later, Emma arrived at the safe house, snowflakes dusting her hair. She stepped inside and was immediately met with Caleb's wide-eyed stare. Without a word, he ran to her and wrapped his arms around her waist. Emma crouched down and hugged him back, her eyes shimmering. We found them, Caleb. They're safe. Caleb pulled back just enough to look up at her. You kept your promise. Emma smiled, brushing a lock of hair from his face. So did you. The safe house, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now buzzed with quiet relief. The children drifted back to their makeshift beds, their small bodies finally relaxing in the warmth. Ethan and Emma sat by the fire, cups of coffee in hand. You did it, Ethan said quietly. Emma shook her head. We all did. You gave those kids hope when they had none. Ethan stared into the fire's glow. They deserve a real home, a real chance. Emma nodded. And they'll get one. Outside, the first light of dawn broke through the trees, casting a golden glow over the snow. The nightmare was over, but the memory of it would linger for a long time. Yet, as the sun rose over the quiet town, it carried with it something stronger than fear-hope. The early morning sunlight filtered through the windows of the safe house, casting a warm, golden glow over the living room. The fire in the hearth had died down to a soft bed of embers, and the air smelled faintly of pine and hot cocoa. Ethan sat quietly at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cradled in his hands. His eyes were distant as he replayed the events of the night before the fear, the gunfire, and finally, Emma's call confirming the children had been rescued. The door to the living room creaked open, and Caleb stepped in, rubbing his eyes. He padded over to Ethan and climbed onto the chair beside him. You didn't sleep, did you? Caleb asked, his voice soft. Ethan chuckled lightly and shook his head. Not much. Too much on my mind. Caleb stared at his own small hands, fidgeting slightly. Are they really safe? The other kids? Ethan reached out and placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. They're safe, Caleb. Emma wouldn't lie about that. Caleb's lips quivered, but he nodded. He seemed lighter somehow, the weight of worry loosening its grip on his small frame. A few hours later, the safe house was buzzing with quiet energy. The other children had woken up and were sitting around the table, eating slices of toast with jam and sipping warm milk. Lily giggled as one of the twins made a face when his milk formed a frothy mustache. Emma arrived just after breakfast, looking exhausted but triumphant. She had dark circles under her eyes, but her smile was warm. Morning, everyone, she greeted, stepping inside and brushing the snow from her coat. The children brightened at the sight of her, and even Caleb smiled a rare but genuine moment of joy. Is everything over? Lily asked hesitantly. Emma crouched down so she was at their level and gave a reassuring nod. Yes, sweetie, it's over. James Bennett and his men are in custody. They can't hurt anyone anymore. The children exchanged glances, their small faces slowly softening with relief. After breakfast, Emma and Ethan sat together in the living room as the children played with toys that the officers had brought. The house was filled with the sound of quiet laughter, the kind that hadn't been heard in far too long. Emma rested her head back against the couch, closing her eyes for a moment. You should have seen them, Ethan. Those kids. They were terrified, but they held on. They didn't give up? Ethan's chest tightened, because someone finally came for them. He glanced at Caleb, who was helping Lily build a house out of toy blocks. You gave them a chance. Emma's eyes softened as she watched the children. We did. As the afternoon wore on, a quiet knock at the door broke the peace. Ethan's brows furrowed as he rose to answer. Emma followed, ever cautious. When Ethan opened the door, a kind-looking woman in a gray coat stood on the porch, her face gentle but serious. Beside her was a man with a clipboard and a soft smile. "Good afternoon," the woman began. "My name is Janine Foster. I work with Child Protective Services." Ethan's heart sank slightly, though he knew this moment would come. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. Janine and her colleague entered, removing their coats and offering warm smiles to Emma and Ethan. "We've been working closely with Officer Hale," Janine explained. "We're here to begin the process of finding permanent placements for the children." The room grew still as her words settled in. Caleb, who had been playing quietly, slowly stood and approached the adults. His expression was guarded. "What does that mean?" Janine knelt down to meet his gaze. "It means we're going to find safe homes for you and your siblings, places where you can stay and feel loved." Caleb's face tensed. "I don't want to go to another place. We've been to too many places." His voice cracked with emotion. Ethan crouched beside him, placing a steady hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Caleb, I know it's scary, but Janine is here to help, and no matter where you go, you'll never be alone again." Tears welled in Caleb's eyes. "But what if they don't really care about us?" Emma spoke gently. "We've checked these families, Caleb. They're good people, and you deserve to be with people who can give you the life you've always wanted." Caleb looked at Ethan. "Will you still be there?" Ethan's throat tightened. "I'll always be here, buddy, and you can visit whenever you want. This bakery, it'll always be your home, too." Caleb hesitated for a long moment, then finally nodded. The next few days passed in a blur of careful introductions and plans. Families who had volunteered to foster the children came to visit. They brought gifts, warm scarves, new books, and stuffed animals. The children, who had once been silent and fearful, slowly began to open up. The day Caleb and his siblings left for their new foster home, the safe house felt heavier than it had before. Ethan helped Caleb pack his small bag, folding each shirt carefully. Caleb turned suddenly and hugged Ethan tightly. "I'll never forget you," he whispered. Ethan hugged him back, his eyes stinging. "I'll never forget you either." That evening, the bakery felt quieter than ever. The children's laughter had been replaced by the soft hum of the heater and the occasional chime of the doorbell as customers came in for their evening treats. Thomas stopped by and sat at the counter, watching Ethan move about the kitchen. "How are you holding up?" Ethan smiled faintly. "It's strange. I miss them already, but I'm glad they're safe." Thomas nodded. "You did something incredible, Ethan. You gave them hope." A week later, a letter arrived at the bakery. The handwriting was crooked but unmistakably Caleb's. Ethan opened the envelope slowly and read aloud. "Dear Mr. Ethan, we're safe, and our new foster family is really nice. They have a dog named Tucker, and he's funny. Lily likes the new toys they gave us, but I still miss Hope's hearth. I miss you too. Thank you for everything you did. One day, I'm going to come back and visit. Your friend, Caleb." Ethan smiled as he folded the letter. His heart warmed despite the ache of missing them. The bakery felt fuller somehow, as though the memories of their time there would always remain. Emma walked in as Ethan placed the letter on the counter. "Good news?" she asked with a knowing smile. Ethan nodded. "The best." Emma placed a hand on his shoulder. "You gave them something they'll never forget, Ethan." Ethan looked out the window, watching the snow fall gently over the town. "Hope," he murmured. "We gave them hope." The snow had finally stopped, leaving Maple Grove blanketed in a pristine white layer that shimmered under the soft winter sun. Hope's hearth was quiet in the early hours of the morning, the smell of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls filling the air. Ethan moved around the kitchen with familiar ease, though there was a noticeable calmness in his movements. The bakery felt different now, quieter, but not empty. In every corner, Ethan could still feel traces of the 5 children who had stayed there. He remembered Caleb's watchful gaze from the window, Lily's giggle as she helped decorate cookies, and the twins curled up near the fire. The doorbell chimed softly as the first customer of the day walked in. It was Emma, bundled in a thick coat and scarf. She smiled as she pulled off her gloves and sat at the counter. "You're here early," Ethan greeted, setting a fresh mug of coffee in front of her. Emma cupped the mug in her hands and sighed contentedly. "I figured I'd stop by before work. It's been a long week." Ethan smiled knowingly. "Tell me about it." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Emma spoke again. "How are you doing?" Ethan leaned against the counter, thinking, "Better, I miss them, but I know they're okay." He tapped the letter from Caleb that still sat neatly on the shelf. "That helps." Emma's gaze softened. "He'll keep his promise, you know. Caleb's the kind of kid who keeps his word." Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, he's tougher than most adults I know." The morning passed with a steady stream of regular customers. Mrs. Rosen came in, cheerful as always, and asked for her usual apple muffins. Edward, the mailman, stopped by for 2 slices of pie, one for himself and one for his grumpy wife. The bakery's warmth seemed to wrap around everyone who entered, filling them with a sense of peace. By late afternoon, the bakery was quiet again. Ethan had just wiped down the last table when the doorbell chimed once more. He turned and froze for a moment. Standing in the doorway was a familiar figure, a small boy with a winter hat pulled low over his ears. Caleb. Lily peeked out from behind him, holding a stuffed dog, followed by the twins, who clung to each other. Their foster parents stood behind them, smiling warmly. "Ethan!" Caleb's voice was filled with joy as he ran forward. Ethan crouched just in time to catch the boy in a tight hug. "Caleb!" He held the boy close, his chest tight with emotion. Lily rushed forward next, and Ethan scooped her up, laughing as she wrapped her arms around his neck. The twins followed, giggling as they tugged at his sleeves. Ethan looked up at their foster parents, who stepped inside with kind smiles. "We were in town for errands and thought we'd surprise you," the foster mother said. "They've been asking about you non-stop." Ethan's heart felt full to bursting. "This is the best surprise I could have asked for." Emma arrived just minutes later, breathless as she entered. "I heard voices." She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening when she saw the children. "Caleb?" Caleb grinned and waved. "We're back." Emma's eyes shone as she hugged Lily, who giggled at the attention. "It's so good to see you," Emma said, her voice soft. The bakery filled with warmth and laughter as Ethan set out mugs of hot cocoa and plates of cookies. The children chattered excitedly about their new home, telling stories about Tucker, the clumsy but lovable dog, and the family dinners they now shared. Caleb's face lit up as he spoke. "Our foster family is really nice, but I told them we had to come back and visit." Ethan smiled, ruffling Caleb's hair. "You're always welcome here. Always." As the afternoon turned to evening, the foster parents thanked Ethan for the warm welcome and began gathering the children to head home. Caleb hesitated near the door, looking back at Ethan. "You really mean it? We can visit any time?" Ethan crouched to meet his gaze. "Of course. Hope's Hearth will always be your home, no matter where you live." Caleb's smile was small, but bright. "Okay, I'll be back." Lily ran up for one last hug, whispering, "I love this place." Ethan's heart swelled as he watched them leave, their laughter lingering even after the door closed behind them. Later that night, as the last of the snowflakes drifted down, Emma stayed behind to help clean up. "That was something, wasn't it?" she asked as she stacked the chairs. Ethan nodded, his smile soft. "It was everything." Emma leaned against the counter, watching as Ethan straightened a row of baking tins. "You know, you're not just a baker anymore, Ethan. You've become something else to this town." Ethan tilted his head. "Oh, what's that?" Emma smiled. A reminder that kindness changes lives. Ethan's gaze drifted to the frosted window, where the reflection of the glowing hearth danced. I guess Hope's hearth really lives up to its name. Emma nodded, her eyes shining with quiet pride. It does, and so do you. The bakery slowly dimmed as Ethan turned off the lights and locked the door. The night sky was clear, and the stars twinkled above the snowy town. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt at peace. The children were safe. James Bennett and his men would never hurt anyone again, and the promise he'd made to Caleb that they would find safety and a new beginning had come true. As Ethan walked home, the snow crunching softly beneath his boots, he thought about the future. He didn't know what it would hold, but he knew one thing for certain. Hope wasn't just something you waited for. It was something you built brick by brick, act by act, like the warmth of a hearth on a cold winter's night. And sometimes, that hope could change everything. This story reminds us that even in the face of fear and hardship, kindness, courage, and hope can build something unbreakable. Ethan's determination to protect the children, Emma's unwavering pursuit of justice, and the resilience of Caleb and his siblings prove that even the smallest lights can drive out the darkness. Every act of compassion, no matter how small, can create a ripple that changes lives. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and share it with others who believe in the power of kindness and second chances. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories of resilience, hope, and everyday heroes. Thank you for your support, and we look forward to sharing more stories with you. See you soon.